PlayStation 1 is one of the consoles of all time. For some of you, the PlayStation 1 represents nostalgia. But for most of you, this is just another bagel toaster.
It may look like a harmless bagel toaster.
Thanks to games like Bloodborne PSX, Paratopic, and Buckshot Roulette, PlayStation 1 games are very much alive. It turns out, people really do want short games with worse graphics, and what better than to capitalize on this trend? But before we start making our game, we need to first learn what makes a PS1 game. PlayStation 1 games are most known for their weird graphics and mind-boggling effects. This was primarily due to hardware limitations at the time. At a glance, you can't really tell what these limitations were, and neither did the developers. Developers! The more obvious limitations were related to memory and graphics, like the resolution being limited to 640 by 480 pixels. Similarly, texture sizes were capped at 256 by 256 pixels, with only 8 bits of color depth.
Ooh.
Meaning, everything was a little bit grainy and muddy. Some of the more interesting limitations were the lack of MIP mapping, Z-buffer, and lighting. MIP mapping is the art of caching textures at different sizes. The key point here is that the N64 had this feature and the PS1 did not. And it became quite obvious when you compare games on both consoles. Thanks Sony. The lack of Z-buffer meant that developers had to invent their own Z-buffer in software and simulate depth of field. Thanks Sony. But by far my favorite limitation was not having a lighting solution. Like the Z-buffer, developers had to invent their own. And the best way to do this was to bake light into the textures, which would be done using vertex colors. Now you might look at this and think it's not that big of a deal, just a little bit of extra points here and there for the artist to paint. But if any of you played the original Silent Hill, you would remember that that game had a flashlight, but the hardware had no concept of lighting. So developers invented a flashlight just for this game. Thanks Sony. Taking everything we've just learned about the PlayStation 1, we can use both Blender and some fancy shader code to recreate the visuals. Some of you might think that I've missed the iconic texture jitter, but believe me, I have not. I know about the jitter. It's because the PS1 did not have floating point precision. Again, thanks to Sony, there are shaders to create that effect too, but personally, I don't like it. It doesn't add any substantial benefit to the player or to the player experience. There is a reason why most cutscenes on the PlayStation 1 have characters standing still or making minimal movements. Now that we have a better understanding of the PlayStation 1, we can start making our game. To show this, I've created a simple scene with a crate, and then I made a TV, and a computer, and a phone, and a cell door, and a big red counter. Wait a minute, this game starts in prison? Why does this feel familiar? Unfortunately, you can't escape and suddenly get to play PlayStation 1 Oblivion. As amazing as that would be, this is my first time making a PlayStation 1 game, and I definitely needed to set myself a limit. But do you know what did not have a limit? That's right, lighting. We can use modern engines to save ourselves some time. Though I still ended up using vertex colors here and there just to make that authentic PlayStation 1 look. But why prison, you might ask? Well, there are a few simple reasons. If you remember from earlier in the video, we talked about how PS1 graphics tend to be a bit grainy and muddy. And for this reason, some games in the PS1 era use darker environments to hide the flaws of the console. You can definitely see this in games like Dino Crisis and in games today, like Compound Fracture, which builds on top of this idea, taking full advantage of the muddiness and throwing you in a swamp. Now, I'm only one guy doing this part-time, so I didn't have the resources to make a swamp, so prison was the next best thing. Even if the prison room is fairly well lit, emotionally it feels depressing, which matches the texture limitations of the PS1. Your sole task in this prison really is to find and report spam. That's right, the game is called spamware, like malware or everyone's favorite ransomware, but with spam. The TV is the simplest of the three. There is a satisfying power button and 4 channels. Each channel plays something different, and you have to find out which of these is legitimate and which of these is spamware. The phone is a little bit more complicated. It also has satisfying buttons, but now you have to figure out what to dial and who to call. Again, trying to figure out if the person on the other side is real or spamware. We also have a computer, which is by far the most complicated. You file reports, look through different commands on the terminal, and even read your emails. There is also a web feature planned. I would like it to be similar to Hypnospace Outlaw, but that might be a bit too ambitious. And finally, we have the bed, which just progresses the in-game day. Oh, what's that? You'd like to know more about this big red clock above the prison door? I'm sorry, you're going to have to figure that one out yourself. I would also like to thank Summer85 and Retro Plus for their great Blender tutorials. Oh, but the phone? Yeah, I'm taking full credit for that piece of junk. There are funny moments in the game too, like dialing random numbers will sometimes return interactions with people, or how you can go to sleep with the phone handle, or how you can play funny tunes with the door sound effect.
This is as much as I'm willing to reveal, given that the demo for the game is not very long. And you did hear that right, there is a demo coming on Steam. Consider wishlisting the game if you want to be notified when it comes out.